Alright, hello and welcome. Today I'll be talking about another technology article that I found on Reddit and going over some of the science behind it, explaining some of the things that they gloss over about, some of the more pop science-y sort of stuff. I'll actually go to detail about what they're talking about. But getting into the article, they were talking about a new enzyme created using an AI, which allows them to break down plastic much faster than the plastic breakdown, in nature. Say a week versus a century that it breaks down in. I'll sort of explain what an enzyme is, explain a bit about how plastic works, and go over what I think they're talking about with the AI, but they don't really explain how they used an AI to make this, but I'll talk about that later. So of course, plastics are very common in our society. We almost everything has some sort of plastic in it, from keyboards to water bottles to, any disposable wrappers or containers. So, a large portion of the waste that we have is plastics, and it would be nice to be able to recycle them effectively, or at the very least, get rid of them and get them out of the environment. But the issue is that plastics are so useful and so common because they're very durable and they don't break down. But once we throw them away, we want them to break down, and unfortunately it takes, they say, 100 years, potentially even more, for certain plastics to break down naturally. Which means, over the course of, the decades that we'll be using plastics, things are just going to build up in landfills and never really break down. And, as I say, very durable, very hard to get rid of. But a team at University of Texas claims to have made an enzyme that can break down certain plastics much faster than the centuries that we're talking about. Unfortunately, it only really works on a single plastic called PET, which they say accounts for about 12% of the plastic we use, but that's not great, but it's better than having 0% of plastic recycled, which it isn't the current case, but could be the case. But the question is, what is this PET that they're talking about? The polyethylene terephthalate, as they call it. And it's kind of complicated, but if you look at the structure of polyethylene, which is the first part of that name, it's essentially the simplest polymer that we make, which polymers are basically the things that make plastics. And it's essentially a long chain of these single subunits, which, through a chemical reaction, basically link them together to make chains of, thousands of single carbon atoms in this case, which link together and form a really strong chain, but a chain that, in this case, is very inert, since it has no variation in the structure, no real stuff for anything to latch onto. So, in say a landfill or something, it's not going to break down over even hundreds of years because there's not many things that would really react with it. So polyethylene is very useful, but pretty bad when you put it in a landfill. There's not much that can be done with it. But with polyethylene terephthalate, which is called PET, there's a lot more stuff going on. You can see it's a way more complicated structure. Even though it actually does still have this this PE polyethylene part of it, it also has a much larger part with some oxygen atoms and this big ring. And it's not too important to understand what the structure is representing, but the idea is that it gives, in this case, it gives an enzyme a place to latch onto and start to break down the molecule, break down the chain, and ideally take the chain and turn it back into the single segments that we use to make the chain. And that's really the idea of this article, is that you go from this really long chain of molecules to breaking it down to the initial monomers, as they say, which monomers is basically just these single subunits. And from those monomers, of course, you could then reverse the process and just make a plastic again, which, obviously, we want to be making less plastic, but if you're going to make plastic, you might as well be able to recycle it and use it to, not have to bring in more things to make more plastic and end up with a lot of stuff in landfills. If you just recycle all of it, being sort of a net zero amount of plastic being brought into the world. So yeah, as they say, depolymerization, which is the process I'm talking about, allows them to break apart the plastic into the initial components and then reform it to make a new plastic. And this process only really works, as far as I know, for PET. But in theory, you could do it with other things. Maybe not polyethylene, but for some of the other complex polymers, which there are a lot of very complex polymers. There's probably a lot that can be recycled with similar methods. But anyway, enough about the structures. The thing they're actually using to recycle this is called an enzyme, which can sort of be thought of as a little molecular machine that works in biological cells. So it's present, in this case, they're using it from a bacteria, but of course human cells have all sorts of enzymes as well for, building cells, maintaining DNA, doing basically any chemical reaction. Almost all chemical reactions use some sort of enzymes to allow things to live. But in this case, they're using a very specific engineered enzyme that will attach to that PET structure and break it down a lot faster than some naturally occurring enzymes. So you can see the actual sort of a schematic for the way that an enzyme would break something down is that it has a certain shape that it, in this case, it's engineered or usually would just evolve to specifically bind to a certain part of a certain molecule. In this case, the two or some number of PET segments would bind to this enzyme. Within the enzyme, they would sort of break apart, and then afterwards they would just detach separately. In this case, the blue and orange were segments of this original green molecule, but once they attach to the enzyme, they break apart and go their separate ways. And this would essentially happen for the whole long chain of PET subunits. And you would eventually be able to break it down into completely just subunits, get rid of the whole chain, and later on build it back up from scratch. So while this does happen in nature, there's a lot of issues with this naturally occurring enzyme. It needs a very specific temperature and very specific level of acidity, pH. And what this results in is that you need a very specific, circumstances for the recycling of PET to actually happen. And it's very uncontrolled, and it's not really going to be too useful. But the team has created the artificial enzyme that can then work in almost any conditions, but in much more diverse conditions. And in addition to being able to do it in a lab, they could then apply this to nature, break down some of the PET that's present in pollution and stuff. And anyway, the actual enzyme that they make is called fast PETase, which sounds funny, but it stands for functional, active, stable, and tolerant PETase, which the ACE part is sort of just a naming convention for enzymes. It just means that it reacts with PET, in this case breaks it down. But the name, in addition to being functional active, I guess it just works to break down PET. It's also very stable and tolerant, which means it's not going to break down at slightly higher temperatures. It's not going to stop working just because it's a little too acidic or a little too basic or something. And of course, it also does work very quickly, very fast, to break down the PET much faster than it would in nature, than the natural version would. And as they say, break down 51 different varieties of plastic. I'm assuming different varieties of PET. There's different things you can add to the chain, stuff like that. But an enzyme like this would only work for PET. It wouldn't really work for any number of other plastics you could think of that don't contain any of the PET segments. But anyway, it says complete degradation took less than 8 days across the board. I'm assuming they mean for the different samples they use. It just digested in 8 days, but regardless of the exact number of days it takes, it's much better than the 100 years that they estimate for the natural degradation. But it sounds like a pretty good tool. A lot of chemistry involved, but where does the AI come in? Of course, says they trained a machine learning algorithm to predict the positions of amino acids and test different sequences and stuff like that. So what this is really saying is that they used some program that allows them to basically design the enzyme, on the molecular level to, instead of just making, thousands of enzymes and testing if they work or not, they just put it in a computer. The computer tells them what it's going to end up being once they produce the enzyme from, whatever means. This really speeds things up very quickly because they can make an AI representation of it, find, an enzyme that works perfectly, or, a range of enzymes with minor alterations or something, and just produce, 5 enzymes instead of thousands, and guarantee that at least one of them will work pretty well. And this really represents one of the big breakthroughs in the protein construction technology, thanks to AI, where, without going into too much detail, in the past, it was very hard to really, predict what proteins would look like once you make them, because proteins, much like the plastics actually, are just long chains of these, subunits called, amino acids. Probably heard of those. But amino acids are way more complicated than the simple PET molecules, and essentially makes a nightmare of a simulation if you want to predict what proteins are going to look like. But using AI and the machine learning algorithm they talk about, regardless of which AI they're using, it's sort of uncomparable between the programs we built in the past for protein folding versus the stuff we have now. I think at least the Google one is 90% accurate or something, which is extremely good for at least this situation where, if you say 90% confidence that something you put into a computer will work when you make it into a real thing, that speeds things up exponentially. So this really, some progress has been made in making plastic recycling enzymes in the past, but using AI to do it will, they say, it recycles at warp speed or something. Really, they're developing at warp speed thanks to the AI support. This article shows off some very cool emerging technology. It's be very beneficial for the environmental movement, trying to get some of the pollution out of the world. But there's one thing in the article that I'm not a big fan of. They say that this is very much a part of the climate crisis. I'm not an expert in global warming. Maybe this has some effect on it, but I think they're kind of just lumping it in because it sounds good. I think plastics are, harming the environment, killing all sorts of sea creatures and stuff, which is horrible, but I don't think that really has anything to do with the climate. But, it's sort of just the political, making science stuff very political to try and get funding for it or whatever. It's like, I'd prefer if they didn't, try to make it sound like plastic is causing global warming, which I don't think it is. But whatever they have to do to get people to watch, to read, But anyway, this is a very beneficial technology. Really shows how humans are creating some big problem, and unfortunately we've don't have a great solution, but we have now built AIs that can help us to find a solution. Sort of digging yourself a hole, but eventually finding something down there that lets you dig yourself back up. But anyway, hope you found this interesting. Hopefully the technical chemistry stuff wasn't a bit too confusing. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.